They thought it was just an abandoned camp. What they found that night was something no one should ever see. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. There's something unsettling about forests at night. In daylight, their paths feel almost inviting. Their trees like guardians of peace. But when the sun dips below the horizon, the woods become something else entirely. An endless wall of shadows, filled with whispers of things unseen. It was into such a place that a group of teenagers ventured, chasing adventure and freedom during the last days of summer. They weren't the first to choose these woods for a night of camping. Years earlier, this part of the forest had hosted a summer camp for children, a place of laughter, games, and songs by the fire. But one summer, that laughter had stopped. The camp had been abandoned, left to rot in silence. Most people in town didn't talk about why. Some claimed financial troubles, others whispered of accidents. But the oldest residents sometimes lowered their voices and spoke of something darker, something that drove everyone away and kept them from returning. The teenagers, of course, knew none of this. To them, it was just a story waiting to be told, an adventure to share when school started again. They carried their tents, food, and flashlights, laughing as they hiked deeper into the forest. By the time they stumbled upon the old camp, the sky had already turned pale orange, the light fading fast. The camp was more intact than they expected. Wooden cabins stood in crooked lines, their windows broken, doors hanging from rusted hinges. The main lodge loomed at the center, its roof sagging, its porch covered in dead leaves. Faded signs still clung to posts, their cheerful paint peeling into ghostly fragments. At first, the teenagers thought they had struck gold. An abandoned camp meant shelter, a story worth telling, and maybe even some relics left behind. But as they explored, a different feeling crept in. It wasn't the natural fear of darkness, nor the thrill of trespassing. It was something heavier, like a presence that lingered in the air, watching them. One of them found a row of old bunk beds inside a cabin, the mattresses long rotted. Another stumbled upon the dining hall, where tables were still set in crooked rows, as if waiting for children who would never return. In one corner lay a mess of overturned chairs, scattered like something violent had occurred. Still, laughter carried them through. They chose a spot near the fire pit, where charred logs still circled a ring of stones. They pitched their tents and lit a fire, the orange glow pushing back the shadows. The woods around them felt quiet, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The first strange thing happened when one of them wandered toward the cabins with a flashlight. The beam caught something in a window just for a second, a pale shape like a face, staring back before vanishing into the dark. They laughed it off, blaming reflections, nerves, or tricks of the mind. But the one who saw it swore it was there. As night deepened, the mood shifted. The camp, once a playground of discovery, began to feel like a trap. The fire's warmth could not chase away the chill that seemed to seep from the abandoned buildings. And the silence grew heavier, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig in the distance. When they finally decided to sleep, unease had settled into every one of them, though none admitted it aloud. The forest seemed to press in around their tents, each rustle of leaves sounding like footsteps. They told themselves it was just animals. That's what it had to be. But as midnight approached, something stirred in the camp. Darkness in the forest comes quickly. By the time the group finished setting up their small fire, the trees had already melted into towering silhouettes, and the air had grown heavy with the scent of damp soil and pine resin. The abandoned camp loomed just beyond the flickering light, its outline swallowed in shadow, its silence even deeper at night. The teens tried to reassure themselves with laughter, the kind of strained laughter that never truly touches the heart. The truth was obvious. No one felt comfortable here. Something about the camp didn't just feel old and deserted, it felt watched. The cracked wooden cabins, the rusted swings creaking ever so slightly in the wind. The darkened mess hall with its broken windows, everything seemed to hold a memory that refused to die. As the fire burned lower, the forest seemed to press closer. The night was unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no owls, only the occasional rustle, as though unseen feet moved through the underbrush. And then came a sound that froze them all. It was faint at first, drifting through the trees, the echo of children's laughter. Thin, distant, yet undeniably real. It rose and fell, as if from the cabins themselves, as if the camp was alive again. The group sat motionless, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to step into the glow of their fire. But nothing came. Hours passed. The laughter faded, but the unease only grew. Shadows lengthened unnaturally against the cabin walls, bending in directions the fire could not explain. When one of them finally worked up the courage to glance at the swings, they swayed back and forth, though no wind stirred. The abandoned camp was no longer abandoned. As midnight drew closer, the air turned colder. Breath hung white in front of their faces. Then the noises began again, not laughter this time, but the sound of movement. Footsteps on gravel. Doors slamming in cabins that no longer had doors. The forest seemed to breathe with them, whispering and exhaling in rhythms that matched their racing hearts. The night was only just beginning. The night in the abandoned camp deepened, and with it, the forest seemed to come alive. The crickets had gone silent, leaving behind only the whisper of wind moving through skeletal branches. The campers tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but the woods had a way of pressing against their nerves, magnifying every sound, every shadow. Somewhere in the darkness, a faint creak echoed, like the swing of an old door swaying on rusted hinges. Yet there were no cabins nearby, at least none they had noticed before. The sound was too deliberate, too slow to be just the forest. It came again, followed by the groan of woods straining underweight. The campfire flickered unnaturally, bending its flame toward the empty cabins as though pulled by a draft. The teens shifted closer together, though none admitted their growing dread. They had laughed earlier about ghost stories and urban legends, but now silence bound them, each unwilling to say what they all felt, that something unseen had awakened. The smell reached them next. It was faint at first, just a whiff of rot carried on the breeze, like wet leaves left to decay too long. But as the minutes passed, the odor grew stronger, thicker, clinging to their clothes, seeping into their hair. It was the smell of something long dead, but disturbed. One of them pointed toward the tree line, though no words followed. Beyond the firelight, something shifted between the pines. A silhouette, wrong in proportion, lingered just long enough to be seen, then melted back into the black. The group froze, hearts pounding, but again no one spoke. The camp itself seemed to breathe. The empty cabins stood with broken windows, their interiors swallowed in shadows, yet faint lights flickered inside, like lanterns glowing for a moment before snuffing out. The teenagers told themselves it was just their eyes adjusting to the dark, but deep down they knew. The camp was not empty. It had never been empty. And then the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy dragging. They circled the campfire, just outside the reach of the light. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched, but no figure stepped forward. It was as though the forest itself walked around them, waiting, measuring their fear. The teens finally huddled close, every instinct screaming that they should run, but their bodies would not obey. Because somewhere behind the fire, in the dark doorway of the largest cabin, a figure now stood, still as stone, watching. The night had only begun. The forest grew unnaturally still after midnight, as if every living thing had agreed to hold its breath. The campers' fire had died to a faint orange glow, and the once comforting crackle of burning wood was gone. The silence was oppressive, pressing in from every side, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. It was then that the sounds began. At first, they were almost imperceptible. The faint scrape of something moving through pine needles, the dry rustle of fabric brushing against bark. One of the teenagers stirred in their sleep, shivering though the night was not cold. A second sound followed, deliberate footsteps, too heavy to be an animal, too measured to be the wind. They came from the direction of the abandoned cabins. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of dying firelight. No figure could be seen, but the pressure of a presence was undeniable. It was as though the darkness itself had condensed into something aware, something watching. Suddenly, a metallic clink echoed through the trees. The noise was sharp, distinct, the unmistakable sound of a chain being dragged. Every camper woke at once, though none spoke. They sat rigid, straining to see beyond the limits of the weak fire, their wide eyes reflecting orange flickers. Then came the whistle. It was low, broken, and wavering, like someone attempting a tune they had not whistled in years. It carried through the trees with a hollow quality, bouncing back as though the forest itself were mocking it. The sound did not fade but grew stronger, closer, circling them. No one dared move. The whistle stopped suddenly, replaced by something far worse: children's laughter. It was faint, distorted, as if carried across decades. The voices overlapped, giggling and shouting, just as they might have on a summer's afternoon long ago when the camp was full of life. But now, at this hour, in this abandoned place, the laughter was grotesque. It carried an edge of malice, a note of something no longer human. The air grew colder. Frost began to form on the metal clasps of their backpacks, though the night was far too mild for such a thing. One of the campers noticed movement, a shadow darting between trees just beyond the firelight. It was not shaped like a person. Its limbs were too long, its gait too strange. Yet it moved quickly, deliberately, as though hurting them. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving behind only silence, a silence that felt worse than the noise. And then from the darkness, a voice whispered. It was not the voice of a child. It was deeper, ragged, as if the words had been dragged from lungs that had not breathed in years. You shouldn't have stayed. The fire sputtered violently, and all at once the night came alive. From the cabins, every door slammed shut in unison. Windows shattered outward as if punched by invisible hands. The forest, moments ago silent, filled with a deafening chorus of shrieks, whistles, and sobs. The teenagers broke at last. Some bolted toward the trail, others toward their tents, but it made no difference. The forest had awakened, and in the chaos, the old camp seemed to breathe again. The woods were no longer silent. From every direction, whispers emerged, weaving through the trees like invisible threads. They weren't the soft whispers of the wind, but voices, low, urgent, almost chanting. The forest seemed to breathe with them, pulling the group deeper into the nightmare. The abandoned cabins loomed like hollow skulls, their windows black and empty. Yet, as the teenagers looked around, faint lights flickered inside, as though lanterns had been relit after decades of darkness. Shadows moved behind the broken glass, figures pacing slowly, silently, like actors in a play that had already been performed countless times. The realization struck one of them first, then spread like wildfire. This was not just a forgotten camp. This was a stage of death, replaying itself every night, binding anyone foolish enough to enter. The air thickened, heavy with the stench of wet wood and something metallic, like rust or blood. They stumbled toward the clearing where the fire pit had been, desperate to find their bearings. But what greeted them made their stomachs drop. The fire pit was no longer abandoned. Flames roared high, casting long, jagged shadows across the circle. Around it sat children, dozens of them, their faces pale, their eyes lifeless, staring straight ahead. They swayed slightly in unison, their movements unnatural, mechanical, as though guided by unseen strings. The teenagers froze, unable to move, as the children began to hum. The sound was shrill, off-key, vibrating through their bones. It was a lullaby, one that should have been gentle, but here it became a dirge. And then they saw it. Behind the children, towering in the firelight, stood a figure. It had no face, just a stretched mask of flesh where features should have been. Its limbs were too long, bent at odd angles, swaying like broken branches in the wind. Slowly, it raised its arm, and as it did, the children's heads snapped toward the intruders all at once. The forest seemed to collapse inward, every path gone, every tree leaning closer. The teenagers ran, but the woods had changed. What had been familiar trails twisted into endless corridors of black trunks and rotting leaves. Behind them, the humming grew louder, joined now by the laughter of children. No one ever saw them again. The search party scoured the area for weeks, but not a single trace remained. Only their campsite was found, tents collapsed, food untouched, a half-burnt log in the fire pit. And yet, those who dared return to the abandoned camp claimed they heard new voices joining the old ones. The whispers had grown louder. The tragedy had claimed more souls, and the fire on some nights burned once again. By the time the screams faded into the night, the campsite had changed. The fog had thickened, curling like pale fingers around the trees, smothering the dying fire. The forest no longer felt vast and open, but enclosed, like walls pressing in on every side. No one moved. No one breathed. The stillness that followed was worse than the chaos. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The 5 remaining teenagers stood in a tight cluster, wide eyes searching the darkness. But the more they looked, the more they realized that something was wrong. The paths had shifted. The trees stood where they hadn't before. Even the old cabin seemed to be in new positions, as if the camp itself was alive, rearranging. They tried to leave. They tried again and again. Each time they took a trail, it brought them back to the same place, the heart of the abandoned campsite, with the burnt cabins and the cracked sign. Their own footprints circled endlessly in the damp soil. It was then that they understood. They hadn't stumbled into a place of tragedy. They had stepped into a repeating wound, a night carved into the earth, reliving itself over and over. And now they were part of it. The stories whispered years later would speak of strange lights seen through the trees, of voices calling in the dark, of campers who vanished without explanation. The truth, however, was much simpler and far more cruel. That night never truly ended. For the ones who stayed, their fear became fuel for the cycle, binding them to the echo of the horror that had once unfolded here. And so the firelight flickered, the screams repeated, and the abandoned campsite waited for the next group who would stumble upon it, thinking they found nothing more than a forgotten place in the woods. But the camp was never abandoned. It was waiting